In this video I will continue my explanation about the early medieval ages by discussing paragraph 5.5, feudalism and the manorial system. In this video I will only be talking about the fourth learning goal, how the feudal system works. I decided to make two separate videos because this paragraph is actually quite difficult. So get ready and try to understand everything I'm about to tell you. First of all, you've seen this map before. It's the Frankish Empire, and you should know that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Franks conquered large portions of Western Europe, and they were the new rulers of Western Europe, with a king who sat in the Frankish capital of Aachen. The Frankish kings realized that it was actually quite difficult to govern the Frankish Empire. They were in a bit of trouble. So what's up? Why wasn't it so easy to govern the Frankish Empire? Well, first of all, there was a lack of good roads that made traveling in the Frankish Empire quite difficult. At the very start of the Frankish Empire, there were still a lot of Roman roads that they happily used, but those roads, they weren't repaired properly. So in due time, those roads became very bad. It was not easy for a king in Aachen to travel to the other side of his country. So a lack of good roads made it more difficult to govern the country. But there was also the case that the Franks, originally, they didn't have any writing, and very few people in the Frankish Empire could read and write, with the exception of people who worked for the Christian church. But more about that later. So if you're a king in Aachen, you basically cannot simply write down a new law and spread that law throughout your empire, because people will have no clue how to read. That's difficult. Also, in the early medieval ages, because Europe is so very dangerous, there is hardly any trade. If there is no trade, there is no money, and if people have no money, then how can you collect tax as a king? And if you have no tax, the king doesn't get any money, then it also becomes very tough for a king to pay for soldiers or an army. Well, these three things made it difficult for the Frankish kings to govern the Frankish Empire. But there was a solution, and that's the thing we're going to talk about. It's the feudal system. It's also called feudalism. Feudalism was the answer to these problems. The lack of roads, the very few people could read and write, etc. And this feudal system was established by the Franks in the 8th century, so in the year 700 something. So how does this feudal system work? First of all, what is the feudal system? It is a medieval government system based on the bond between a lord and his vassal. Well, that's a bit hard to understand. Do notice that it is a system of government. So the feudal system is a way to govern your lands. Now, let's start out. We have a king, right? And this king, the king of the Franks, he is called the Lord. And the Lord is basically the owner or ruler of a land. But the Lord, the king of the Franks, he cannot rule the entire country on his own. So he calls to his court the people he trusts the most. High nobles, basically his noble BFFs. And the Lord asks, "Please, nobles, would you please govern a part of my land, because I cannot do it on my own. Here you have a part of my land, govern it well, and good luck with that." Giving a part of land to another person, it is called giving a fief. And what is a fief? A fief is basically a piece of land that you get from your lord, and everything else on it. So the villages, the farmers who live in that land, etc. It's all yours. So these high nobles who get a fief from their king, their lord, they are called vassals. And a vassal is a noble who governs a fief for his lord. Now, the fiefs, it's not a present, they get it in loan. So the idea is that at some point the vassals will return the fief to the Lord. The Lord is still the original owner of the entire land. The king is still the original owner of all fiefs, but the vassals govern the fiefs in his name so that the king doesn't have to. The king does want something in return. Maybe you remember that the king has no tax income, and so he doesn't have enough soldiers to properly protect his lands. So he makes the vassals promise him that if there would be a large war, if there would be a conflict, then the vassals would have to send soldiers to assist the king. So if the king says, well, guys, I need your army, then they need to send their army, no question about it. And as a vassal, you couldn't refuse military aid to your lord, because else you would lose your fief, your lands, and everything on it. Now, those vassals, the high nobles, the dukes, for example, they had the very same problem as the king in the start. They received very large fiefs from their lord, and they had to govern that entire piece of land. But that basically wasn't possible, for the very same reason why the king couldn't govern his entire country: a lack of good roads, people could not read and write, etc. And so the vassals, they decided to invite their noble BFFs, the lower nobles, and they would do the exact same thing as the king. They would give fiefs to their lower nobles, and those lower nobles became the vassals of the high nobles. So the high nobles in this case are the lords of the lower nobles, and those lower nobles, they also had to promise the high nobles that if there would be a military conflict, they would send their soldiers. So this is basically the feudal system. So the king governs his lands by giving fiefs to the high nobility, his vassals, and those very same vassals, they also give fiefs to the lower nobles. And so all those vassals get a piece of land in the Frankish Empire to govern. Still with me? Complicated, isn't it? So, if you wanted to have a fief from your lord, you had to pledge filthy to your lord. And that basically means, you can see it on the picture below, you get down on your knees and you promise your lord something. Now, in that filthy, you always had to promise loyalty to your lord. If your lord asked you something, you would do it and you would obey his commands. I already said something about military aid in conflicts. If your lord needed your soldiers, you had to send your soldiers to him. And should the lord need some advice, you also had to provide him with counsel. So basically, in a meeting, the lord could ask you, well, what would you do? And, you could give him some advice. Now, this entire feudal system, it worked well, but it also had some disadvantages. The biggest advantage, a pro, this feudal system made it possible to govern a large country in medieval times. So because of feudalism, the Frankish king was able to govern the Frankish Empire by giving all those fiefs. But there were also a lot of cons, disadvantages. This feudal system only works well if there is a strong king who can keep his vassals under control. So basically, you want to be a strong king because you want your vassals to obey you. If the vassals no longer obeyed their king, then the entire country would go to ruin, because then a large part of the country who were given as a fief to vassals, they would no longer listen to the king, and that would be a very bad thing. Also, a disadvantage, vassals actually had to return their fiefs to their lords when they died. So they only had the fief during their life. When they died, the fief had to be returned to the king. But in reality, this was hardly the case, because those vassals, you know, they had children, and they really wanted their children to own the land as well. So instead of returning the fief to their lords after their death, they basically gave the fiefs to their children. And at some point, the king realized that the vassals weren't giving their lands back. Another problem in the feudal system is the issue with loyalty. Who is loyal to who? Imagine that you are a part of the lower nobility and you didn't pledge fealty to one lord, but you pledged fealty to two lords, and those two lords would go to war with each other. Which side would you choose? Well, the answer is you had to choose both sides. There's actually a story of a person whose lords went to war, and he pledged fealty to both lords. So he sent half his soldiers to one lord and the other half to the other lord. Complicated situation. So, feudalism. If you, here's a tip, especially if you like gaming. If you truly wish to understand this feudal system, I heartily recommend the game Crusader Kings 2. This game actually made me better understand how the medieval times worked. So look it up. It's a very tough game actually, but there are great guides on YouTube should you want to get into it. So the learning goal after this video, you are able to explain how the feudal system works. So you're able to explain the entire system with the king giving fiefs to his vassals, those vassals giving fiefs to the lower nobles, etc. If you have a question, please send me a mail on Magister. I will answer as fast as I can. And good luck with your homework. Don't forget to watch the other video about the manorial system as well.